My husband's coworker called me to confess they've been having an affair, but it was a setup. It was a Tuesday, one of those perfectly ordinary Tuesdays that feel like a gift. The late afternoon sun was streaming through our kitchen windows, casting long, golden rectangles on the hardwood floors. I was humming along to some mindless pop song on the radio, chopping vegetables for a stew I knew my husband, Ethan, would love. The scent of thyme and rosemary filled the air, mingling with the clean, citrusy smell of the furniture polish I'd used that morning. Our life in that moment felt as warm and solid as the ancient oak of our dining table. We'd been married for 7 years, and they had been, without exaggeration, the happiest years of my life. Ethan was my anchor, my best friend, the person whose laughter could still make my heart do a little flip. We had our routines, our inside jokes, a comfortable, unshakable partnership that I cherished. I was just dropping the carrots into the pot when my phone buzzed on the granite countertop. The number was unknown, a local area code I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it, assuming it was a telemarketer, but something, a fleeting, unexplainable nudge of intuition, made me swipe the screen to answer. I pressed the phone to my ear, my elbow propped on the counter, still stirring the stew. "Hello?" A woman's voice, shaky and thick with what sounded like tears, came through the line. Is this Ethan's wife?" My hand froze on the spoon. A knot of unease, cold and sharp, tightened in my stomach. "Yes, this is she. Who is this?" There was a choked sob on the other end, a sound of pure, gut-wrenching distress. "My name is Amelia," she whispered. "I work with Ethan. I'm so sorry to be calling you like this. I don't know what else to do." The kitchen suddenly felt colder, the golden light now seeming harsh and unforgiving. The thyme and rosemary scent was cloying, sickly. I leaned against the counter, my knuckles white. "Amelia? I don't think I've heard him mention you. Is everything all right? Is Ethan okay?" Another sob, louder this time. "No," she cried, her voice cracking. "No, everything is not okay. I have to tell you something. I can't live with this lie anymore. It's eating me alive." My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, a wild, chaotic rhythm that drowned out the radio, the bubbling stew, the sound of my own breathing. I knew, with a horrifying, bone-deep certainty, that I was not going to like what came next. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the solid ground of my perfect Tuesday turning to quicksand. Her next words were a blur of static and despair, a confession that landed like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. "We've been having an affair," she wept. "Me and Ethan. It's been going on for months, and I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." The phone slipped from my grasp, clattering onto the counter. I stared at it, as if it were a venomous snake. The voice on the line kept talking, offering details, dates, places, a hotel downtown, late nights working, a supposed business trip to Chicago that was anything but. Each word was a new shard of glass, embedding itself in the fragile picture of my life. My perfect, beautiful life with my perfect, loving husband. It was all a lie, a sham, a carefully constructed facade. I didn't hang up. I just stood there, listening to the sound of my world ending, one tearful, fabricated word at a time. The woman on the other end, this Amelia, was still crying, still apologizing, but her voice was becoming distant, muffled, as if I were sinking to the bottom of a very deep, very dark ocean. The sun had dipped below the horizon now, and the kitchen was bathed in shadows. The stew was boiling over, a thick red froth spilling onto the stovetop, but I didn't move. I couldn't. I was paralyzed, trapped in the wreckage of a single, devastating phone call. The sound of the garage door opening was the only thing that could have pierced the thick fog of shock that had enveloped me. It was a familiar, comforting sound, the mechanical groan and whir that signaled Ethan was home. Tonight, it was the sound of a guillotine blade falling. I had managed to switch off the stove and wipe up the spilled stew, my movements robotic, detached. The phone call had ended minutes ago when Amelia had finally cried herself out, leaving me with a dead line and a dead heart. I was sitting at the kitchen table, my hands folded in my lap, staring at the darkened window. The reflection that stared back was a stranger, a pale, hollow-eyed woman with her hair pulled back in a messy bun, her face a mask of disbelief. The back door creaked open, and there he was, Ethan, home from work. He dropped his briefcase by the door, his smile tired but genuine, the way it always was after a long day. He shrugged off his jacket, the familiar gesture sending a fresh wave of agony through me. "Hey you," he said, his voice warm and full of love. "Something smells amazing in here. I'm starving." He walked over to me, leaning down to kiss the top of my head, his lips lingering in my hair. I flinched, a tiny, involuntary movement that I couldn't suppress. He must have felt it, because he straightened up, his smile faltering slightly. "Everything okay?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "You look a little pale." I couldn't speak. The words were lodged in my throat, a lump of pure, unadulterated pain. How could he stand there, looking at me with such genuine affection after what he had done? How could he lie so effortlessly, so convincingly? The anger, hot and sharp, began to bubble up from beneath the icy shock. It was a saving grace, a life raft in the sea of my despair. It gave me strength. I slowly lifted my head and met his gaze. His eyes, the same warm caramel eyes I had fallen in love with, were searching mine, full of worry. I saw no guilt there, no deception, just confusion, and that made it even worse. He was a better actor than I had ever given him credit for. "Who is Amelia?" I asked, my voice a low, dangerous monotone. It was a voice I barely recognized as my own. The effect on him was instantaneous. The color drained from his face. His eyes widened, not with guilt, but with what looked like genuine baffled shock. "Amelia?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "Amelia from work? What about her?" I stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. I couldn't be in the same room as him, couldn't breathe the same air. I started pacing, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. "Don't," I hissed, the anger finally boiling over. "Don't you dare stand there and pretend you don't know who I'm talking about. She called me, Ethan. She called me and told me everything." He just stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, his face a canvas of utter incomprehension. "Told you what?" he asked, taking a step toward me, his hand outstretched. I don't understand. What did she tell you?" I laughed then, a harsh, ugly sound that was more like a sob. "She told me about the affair," I spat, the words tasting like poison in my mouth. "She told me about the hotel and Chicago and all the other late nights you weren't working. She told me everything, you son of a bitch." The last words were a scream, a raw, guttural cry of pure anguish that tore from my throat. Ethan recoiled as if I had struck him, his hand dropping to his side. His face was a mask of horror, his eyes wide with disbelief. "No," he said, shaking his head slowly, back and forth, back and forth. "No, that's not possible. I would never." He looked so devastated, so utterly destroyed by my accusation, that for a fleeting, insane moment, I almost believed him. But then I remembered Amelia's voice, her tears, the specific, damning details she had provided. It was all true. It had to be. "Just get out," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "I can't even look at you right now. Just get out of my house." He opened his mouth to say something else, to protest, to deny it one last time, but I held up a hand, stopping him. "Go," I commanded, my voice trembling with rage and heartbreak. "Go to a hotel or go to her. I don't care. Just get out." He stood there for a long moment, his shoulders slumped, his face a picture of utter defeat. Then, without another word, he turned, picked up his jacket, and walked out the door, the sound of his footsteps on the porch echoing the death knell of our marriage. I sank to the floor, my body racked with sobs, the silence of the house pressing in on me, heavy and absolute. The first few hours after Ethan left were a blur of rage and grief. I moved through the house like a ghost, my fingers tracing the outlines of a life that now felt like a museum exhibit. Beautiful, but no longer mine. I picked up a framed photo of us on our honeymoon, his arm wrapped around my waist, our faces pressed together, smiling against a backdrop of a brilliant blue ocean. I stared at it, trying to reconcile the man in the picture with the monster I had just thrown out of my house. The two images refused to overlap. As the night wore on, however, the fiery anger began to cool, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I was done being a victim. I was done crying. I needed proof. Not just a tearful confession from a woman I didn't know, but cold, hard, undeniable evidence. I needed to know everything. I needed to see it for myself. My mission began with his things. I went into his office, a room that had always been his sanctuary, and started to sift through his life. I felt like a burglar, a trespasser in my own home, but the feeling was quickly overshadowed by a grim sense of purpose. I started with his briefcase. It was mostly filled with work-related folders, a couple of pens, a half-eaten bag of almonds, nothing incriminating. Next, his laptop. I knew his password. It was our anniversary, a cruel irony that made my jaw clench. I booted it up, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I went straight to his email, my fingers flying across the keyboard, searching for Amelia's name. Nothing. I searched his sent folder, his trash, his archived messages. Still nothing. I checked his browser history, my stomach churning with a mixture of dread and morbid curiosity. It was mostly news sites, sports scores, and a few car forums he frequented. No secret email accounts, no shady dating sites, no hotel reservations. It was all depressingly normal. Frustration began to prickle at the edges of my resolve. Was he just that careful, that good at covering his tracks? I moved on to his wallet, which he had left on his dresser in his haste to get out. I emptied it onto the bed, my hands shaking. Credit cards, debit card, driver's license, a picture of me tucked into a clear plastic sleeve.
I pulled out his credit card statements, my eyes scanning the transactions for the dates Amelia had mentioned. The hotel downtown, the expensive dinners, the business trip to Chicago. I found the dates she had specified, my breath catching in my throat. But the charges listed were for gas stations, grocery stores, and a couple of takeout places near his office. There was nothing. No hotel charges, no expensive restaurant bills, no airline tickets to Chicago. It was as if the affair she had described so vividly had never happened. But that was impossible. She knew too much. She had been too specific. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. Was I the one who was crazy? Was this all some elaborate, twisted hoax? But why? Why would a stranger call me out of the blue and destroy my life for no reason? It didn't make any sense. I was about to give up, to collapse into a heap of confusion and despair, when a memory surfaced, a fragment of Amelia's tearful confession. She had mentioned a specific detail, a small, seemingly insignificant thing that I had latched onto in my haze of shock. She had said that one of their dates was a late-night dinner at a fancy Italian restaurant on the other side of town, a place called La Grata. She had even described the dish he had ordered, veal saltimbocca. It was a detail so specific, so mundane, that it had rung true. A new plan began to form in my mind, a desperate, long-shot idea. If I couldn't find the proof here, I would find it there. I would go to the restaurant. I would talk to the manager. I would do whatever it took to get a look at their security footage from that night. It was a crazy plan, invasive and probably illegal, but I was past caring. I needed to see it with my own eyes. I needed to see him sitting there with her, laughing, sharing a bottle of wine, living a lie. I needed the closure that only a visual confirmation could provide. I grabbed my keys and my jacket, my mind racing. I didn't know what I would find, but I knew I had to go. I had to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The drive across town was a surreal experience. The city lights blurred into a kaleidoscope of color, the familiar streets feeling foreign and menacing. My hands were clenched on the steering wheel, my knuckles white, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. I was still angry, still heartbroken, but a new feeling had crept in, a sliver of doubt, tiny but persistent. What if I was wrong? What if this was all a terrible misunderstanding? I pushed the thought away. I had heard the conviction in Amelia's voice, the pain in her sobs. She wasn't lying. She couldn't be. I found a parking spot a block away from La Grata, the restaurant's warm, inviting glow, a stark contrast to the cold dread that had settled in my stomach. I sat in the car for a long moment, taking a deep, shaky breath, trying to prepare myself for what I was about to do. I was about to walk into a respectable establishment and accuse a stranger's husband of cheating, all based on a phone call. I felt like a crazy person, but I had to know. I pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The restaurant was exactly as Amelia had described it, dimly lit, with intimate tables covered in white cloths, the air thick with the scent of garlic, basil, and baking bread. A maitre d' with a slicked-back ponytail and a practiced smile greeted me. "Good evening, madam. Do you have a reservation?" I shook my head, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "No," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I was hoping I could talk to the manager. It's a bit of an emergency." The maitre d's smile faltered slightly,
his eyes assessing me with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. He must have seen the desperation in my eyes, the wild, frantic look of a woman on the edge. He nodded curtly and disappeared into a back office, returning a moment later with a portly, balding man in a slightly too tight suit. "I'm the manager," he said, his voice gruff. "What seems to be the problem?" I took another deep breath, my mind racing, trying to come up with a plausible lie. I think I lost my wallet here last week," I said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I'm not sure what day it was, but I was here for dinner. I was hoping you might have found it, or maybe I could look at your security footage to see if I can figure out where I might have dropped it." It was a flimsy story, and I could see the manager wasn't buying it. He crossed his arms over his chest, his expression skeptical. "We haven't had any wallets turned in," he said, "and we don't just let people look at our security footage." I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes, a combination of frustration and fear. I was about to be exposed, to be thrown out onto the street, my last hope of finding the truth dashed. "Please," I begged, my voice cracking. "It's really important. There are some sentimental things in that wallet. I just need to see the footage from last Tuesday night, for just a few minutes. Please." I must have looked as pathetic as I felt, because the manager's stern expression softened just a little. He sighed, running a hand over his bald head. "Fine," he said, his voice grudging, "but just for a few minutes, and you stay right here with me." He led me through a bustling kitchen, the heat and noise a welcome distraction from my churning thoughts, and into a small, cluttered office in the back. He sat down at a desk in front of a bank of monitors and started typing on a keyboard. "What time were you here?" he asked. "Around 8 o'clock, I guessed, my heart in my throat." He pulled up the footage from the restaurant's main dining room, the images grainy and black and white. He fast-forwarded through the recording, the figures on the screen moving in a jerky, silent dance. I leaned in closer, my eyes scanning the tables, searching for a familiar face. I saw couples laughing, families sharing meals, friends clinking glasses. But I didn't see him. I didn't see Ethan. The manager kept fast-forwarding, through 8, 9, 10, still nothing. "Are you sure you have the right night?" he asked, his patience wearing thin. I think so," I stammered, my mind racing. "Maybe it was a little later?" He sighed and kept scrolling, the images a blur of motion. And then, just as I was about to give up, I saw him. Or rather, I didn't see him. The footage showed the entrance to the restaurant, the door swinging open and closed as customers came and went. And in that hour, in that entire time frame, Ethan never walked through that door. Neither did Amelia. They were never there. The manager looked at me, his eyebrows raised. "Well?" he asked. "Do you see yourself?" I shook my head, my mind reeling. "No," I said, my voice hollow. "I don't." I thanked him, my words a mumble, and stumbled out of the office, out of the restaurant, and into the cool night air. I leaned against the brick wall, my body trembling. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. Amelia had been so specific, so convincing. But the footage didn't lie. They weren't there. The dinner she had described, the date she had so tearfully confessed to, it had never happened. It was a lie. But why? Why would she lie about that? And if she lied about the dinner, what else had she lied about? The sliver of doubt in my mind had grown into a gaping chasm. I had to find out where he really was that night. I had to find the truth. The drive home was a silent, agonizing journey through a maze of confusion. The restaurant footage had shattered everything I thought I knew. Amelia's confession, which had been the bedrock of my certainty, was now riddled with holes. If she had lied about the dinner, Had she lied about everything? The possibility was so staggering, so mind-boggling, that I could barely process it. I had spent the last 24 hours convinced of my husband's infidelity, ready to throw away 7 years of marriage based on the word of a stranger. And now, that word was starting to look less like a confession and more like a carefully constructed fiction. When I got home, the house was dark and empty, the silence a stark reminder of the chasm that had opened up between me and Ethan. I couldn't stay there. I needed to move, to do something, to find the answers that were eluding me. I got back in my car and drove, not with a destination in mind, but with a purpose. I needed to find out where Ethan was on the night of the supposed dinner. He had told me he was working late, a story I had dismissed as a flimsy excuse. But what if it was the truth? What if he had been at his office, just as he had claimed? I found myself driving toward his office building, a towering glass and steel structure in the heart of the city. It was after midnight, and the streets were deserted, the building a dark, silent giant. I parked in the empty visitor's lot and sat there for a moment, my heart pounding. This was it. This was the moment of truth. If I could prove that he was at the office that night, if I could find the evidence that backed up his story, then everything would change. I would have to face the possibility that I had made a terrible, irreversible mistake. I got out of the car and walked toward the entrance, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. I knew the building had a 24/7 security desk, and I also knew the night guard, a friendly older man named Frank who I had met a few times at company events. I was counting on his familiarity, on his willingness to help a desperate wife. I pushed the button on the intercom, my hand shaking. "Frank?" I said, my voice a little too loud in the quiet night. "It's me, Ethan's wife. I'm in a bit of a situation. Can you let me in?" There was a long pause, then a crackle of static. "Sure thing," Frank's voice came through the speaker. "Be right there." The door buzzed, and I pulled it open, stepping into the sterile, brightly lit lobby. Frank was waiting for me behind the desk, his face etched with concern. "Everything all right, ma'am?" he asked, his kind eyes searching mine. I think so," I said, my voice trembling. I need to see the security footage from last Tuesday night, from the office floors." Frank's brow furrowed. "I don't know if I can do that," he said slowly. "That's company property. It's against policy." "Please, Frank," I begged, my eyes filling with tears. "It's a matter of life and death. My marriage, it depends on this. I just need to see if Ethan was here that night. He said he was working late, and I didn't believe him." I must have looked as desperate as I felt, because Frank's expression softened. He sighed, a long, weary sound. "All right," he said, his voice low. "But this never happened. You understand?" I nodded, my heart swelling with gratitude. He led me to a small room behind the security desk, filled with monitors and recording equipment. He sat down and started typing, his fingers moving slowly across the keyboard. "What time?" he asked. "He said he'd be late," I said. "Maybe from 7 p.m. onwards?" He pulled up the footage from the 14th floor, where Ethan's team worked. The screen was split into 4 different camera angles, showing the main office area, the hallway, the elevators, and the emergency exit. Frank hit play, and the footage began to roll, a silent, black-and-white movie of a normal workday. I watched, my breath held tight in my chest, as people started to leave the office, their figures shrinking as they walked down the hallway toward the elevators. By 7:30, the office was mostly empty. But then I saw him, Ethan, walking back to his desk with a cup of coffee. He sat down, and for the next hour, he was just a solitary figure, hunched over his computer, typing furiously. Then a few more people started to trickle in, his team members, drawn back to the office by some unseen force. They gathered in the conference room, their faces illuminated by the glow of a projector. I saw Ethan, standing at the front of the room, pointing at a screen, his gestures animated, his expression focused. They were working. They were actually working. Frank fast-forwarded the footage, the images a blur of motion. I saw them order pizza, the delivery guy's arrival a brief interruption in their intense concentration. I saw them laugh. I saw them argue. I saw them work together, a cohesive, dedicated team, long after the rest of the city had gone to sleep. The final timestamp on the footage was 2:17 a.m. I saw Ethan and his colleagues packing up their things, their faces tired but satisfied. They walked down the hallway together, their shoulders slumped with exhaustion, and got into the elevator. They were there, all night, just as he had said. I leaned back in my chair, the air rushing out of my lungs in a whoosh of relief and disbelief. It was true. He had been telling the truth. And Amelia had been lying. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't an affair. It was something else, something much, much worse. The drive home from Ethan's office was a journey through a landscape of profound, earth-shattering clarity. The fog of confusion had lifted, replaced by a cold, hard, and terrifying certainty. Amelia hadn't just lied. She had constructed an elaborate, detailed, and emotionally devastating fiction, a web of deceit so intricate that it had nearly succeeded in destroying my life. And she had done it for a reason I couldn't yet comprehend, but a reason nonetheless. The anger I had felt before, the hot, blinding rage of a betrayed wife, was gone. In its place was something colder, more calculating, and infinitely more dangerous. It was the quiet, simmering fury of a woman who had been played, who had been used as a pawn in a twisted game she didn't understand. I was no longer a victim. I was a hunter, and I was going to find out why. When I got home, the house was still dark and silent, but it no longer felt empty. It felt charged with a new energy, a sense of purpose that had been absent just hours before. I walked into the kitchen, my steps steady and sure, and picked up my phone. My fingers hovered over Amelia's number, a number I had memorized in a fit of masochistic obsession. I took a deep breath, my mind clear, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I was done with tears. I was done with hysterics. This was going to be a different kind of conversation. I pressed the button and the phone started to ring. She answered on the second ring, her voice hesitant, unsure. "Hello?" she said, her voice a cautious whisper. "It's me," I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Ethan's wife." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. I wasn't sure you'd ever call me back," she stammered. "I've been so worried." I almost laughed at the audacity of it, the sheer, unmitigated gall. "Have you, Amelia?" I asked, my voice dripping with a sarcasm that was lost on her. "Have you been worried?" "Of course," she said, her voice trembling what I now recognized as feigned emotion. "I feel just awful about what I did, but I had to tell you the truth. It was the right thing to do." "The truth," I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Let's talk about the truth, shall we? Let's talk about the dinner you and Ethan supposedly had at La Grata last Tuesday." I could hear her sharp, panicked intake of breath. What about it?" she asked, her voice suddenly tight, strained. "Well, I was just curious," I said, my tone casual, conversational, "because I was there tonight, and I had a little chat with the manager, and we looked at the security footage from that night, and you know what I found?" I paused, letting the silence hang in the air, a heavy, suffocating blanket. "I found nothing, Amelia. You weren't there. He wasn't there. The dinner you described in such vivid, tearful detail, it never happened." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I could hear her breathing, short, shallow gasps of air. I don't know what you're talking about," she finally managed to say, her voice a weak, pathetic squeak. "Oh, I think you do," I continued, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous purr. And then I got to thinking, if you lied about the dinner, maybe you lied about other things too. So I went to Ethan's office, and I talked to the night guard, and we looked at the security footage from that night too. And you know what I found there, Amelia? I found him. I found him and his entire team working on a project until 2 in the morning. They ordered pizza, they were exhausted, they were there, all night. I let that sink in, giving her a moment to process the fact that her entire house of cards was collapsing around her. "So," I said, my voice as cold and sharp as a shard of ice, "why don't you tell me the truth, the real truth? Why did you do it? Why did you call me and lie to me? What did you hope to gain?" The dam broke. A torrent of words, a flood of desperate, hysterical confessions poured out of her. It was a jumbled mess of obsession and delusion, of a twisted, one-sided fantasy that had spiraled out of control. She had been obsessed with Ethan for months, she admitted.
He had been kind to her, a friendly smile in the hallway, a helpful hand with a project, and she had misconstrued it, had built it up into something it wasn't. She had seen his wedding ring, had seen pictures of me on his desk, and instead of being deterred, she had become enraged. She wanted him for herself, and if she couldn't have him, she was going to make sure no one could. She had invented the affair. Piece by painstaking piece, researching his schedule, fabricating details, creating a narrative so convincing that even she, in her own twisted mind, had started to believe it. She had called me not out of guilt, but out of a malicious desire to inflict pain, to shatter the happiness that she so desperately craved for herself. It was a confession so chilling, so utterly devoid of remorse that it left me speechless. I listened, my heart a cold, heavy lump in my chest, as this woman, this stranger, unraveled the dark, tangled knot of her own making. And when she was finally done, when she had nothing left to say, there was only one thing left for me to do. I hung up the phone, the sound of her desperate, pleading cries echoing in my ears. I had my answers. Now I had to face the consequences. The silence that followed the phone call with Amelia was profound, a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to muffle the very air in the room. I stood in the center of the kitchen, the phone still clutched in my hand, my mind reeling from the sheer, unadulterated madness of her confession. It was a story so twisted, so utterly devoid of logic and reason that it felt like something out of a bad movie, but it was real. It was my life, and the woman on the other end of the line, this Amelia, was a real person, a real threat, a real and present danger to the life I had built with the man I loved. The first wave of emotion that washed over me was not relief, but a deep, bone-chilling fear. This wasn't just a case of unrequited love or a simple office crush. This was an obsession, a calculated, malicious campaign to destroy my husband, to destroy our marriage, to destroy me. And the fact that she had come so close to succeeding was a terrifying thought. The second wave was a wave of guilt, a crushing, all-consuming sense of shame. I had doubted him, I had accused him, I had thrown him out of our home based on the word of a madwoman. I had let a stranger's poison seep into my heart, and I had allowed it to fester, to grow, to almost consume the love that I had for Ethan. I had to fix this. I had to make it right. I picked up my phone again, my fingers trembling as I scrolled through my contacts, my heart aching with a renewed sense of purpose. I found his number, the one I had been avoiding, the one I had been tempted to block, and I pressed the call button. He answered on the first ring, his voice hoarse, thick with the pain that I had put there. "Hello?" he said, his voice a cautious whisper. "Ethan," I said, my own voice cracking with the weight of my remorse. "It's me. I need to see you. Can you come home, please?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, a silence filled with a universe of hurt and uncertainty. I don't know if that's a good idea," he finally said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Please, Ethan," I begged, my tears finally breaking free, hot and salty on my cheeks. "I was wrong. I was so wrong. Just come home. Let me explain. Please." Another pause, longer this time, then a soft, weary sigh. "Okay," he said, "I'm on my way." The 20 minutes it took for him to get home were the longest of my life. I paced the length of the living room, my mind racing, rehearsing the words I would say, the apology I would offer. But I knew that no words could ever fully express the depth of my regret, the magnitude of my mistake. When I heard his key in the lock, my heart stopped. The door opened, and there he was, standing in the doorway, his face etched with a weariness that went far beyond a simple lack of sleep. He looked smaller, broken, the vibrant, loving man I knew replaced by a shadow of his former self. I ran to him, my arms wrapping around his neck, my body shaking with sobs. "I'm so sorry," I cried, my words muffled against his chest. "I'm so sorry. I was wrong. I was a fool. Please forgive me." He stood there for a moment, his body stiff, unyielding. Then, slowly, hesitantly, his arms came up around me, his hands resting gently on my back. He didn't say anything, but I could feel the tension in his body, the wall of hurt that he had built around himself to protect himself from me.
I pulled away, my hands cupping his face, forcing him to look at me. "It was Amelia," I said, my voice urgent, desperate. "She lied about everything. I have proof. I went to the restaurant. I went to your office. I saw the footage. You were there, just like you said. And then I called her, and she told me everything. She's obsessed with you, Ethan. She made it all up to break us up." I watched as the information slowly sank in, the confusion in his eyes gradually giving way to a dawning, horrified understanding. He sank onto the couch, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "Oh my God," he whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of shock and disgust. "Oh my God." I sat down next to him, my hand on his back, offering what little comfort I could. We sat there in silence for a long time, the weight of Amelia's deception hanging over us, a dark, toxic cloud. But in the midst of the chaos and the pain, something else was beginning to emerge, a sense of solidarity, a shared understanding that we had been through a trauma, a trial by fire that had tested the very foundation of our relationship. We had survived. We were bruised and battered, but we were not broken. The next few days were a blur of activity. We contacted Ethan's HR department, we filed a formal complaint, we provided them with the evidence I had gathered. Amelia was fired, her twisted, destructive fantasy finally brought to an end. But the healing process, we knew, would be a long one. It wasn't just about forgiving Amelia, it was about forgiving myself. It was about rebuilding the trust that had been so callously shattered, not by an affair, but by a lie. It was about learning to love again, not just each other, but ourselves. We went to therapy, we talked, we cried, we held each other through the long, dark nights. And slowly, painstakingly, we began to heal. The scars of Amelia's deception would always be there, a reminder of the fragility of happiness, the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected of places. But they were also a testament to our strength, to the resilience of our love, a love that had been tested by fire and had emerged, not unscathed, but stronger, more precious, and more real than ever before. We had looked into the abyss, and we had chosen, together, to turn away, to walk back into the light.